Alright guys, that's it for the executive branch, and now we're going to be talking about our final branch of government, the judicial branch of the United States. So what is the judicial branch? Well, the judicial branch, in short summary, is the Supreme Court of the United States, as well as more than 100 other federal lower courts beneath the Supreme Court of the United States, all of which we'll talk about at a later date. Here's a nice picture of the Supreme Court in case you weren't on the DC trip a year ago, or maybe you've never seen it before. And in all honesty, it's quite convenient, at least the location of the Supreme Court. It's right across the Capitol building. You literally just cross one street or take the underground tunnel. Quite convenient for an early government where if they had any questions about whether or not a law they were making was constitutional, they could literally go across the street and figure it out. But anywho, the Supreme Court. It's the highest court in our country. There's no other court above the Supreme Court. There are 9 total judges, but we call them justices of the Supreme Court. And whenever there's a verdict in the Supreme Court, that decision is final. No other court in our country can go higher than the Supreme Court and try to reverse that decision. And here are the current justices of the Supreme Court. You don't actually have to know all 9 names of all 9 justices of the Supreme Court, but I do know some people are interested to see who's actually on the bench right now. So you have the Chief Justice, John G. Roberts, and then you have all the other associate justices involved, whether it be Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Samuel Alito, Sotomayor, or even Brett Kavanaugh, who is our most recent addition to the Supreme Court, added by President Trump back in 2018. I know that feels like yesterday, but that's when he chose him. Anywho, what are the roles or the positions on the Supreme Court? Well, if you were looking at those pictures, then you saw that there was a lot of similar roles and then one unique role. You have a Chief Justice and you have the 8 Associate Justices. All justices are equal, as in all their votes count for the same. Think of the Chief Justice as like a Speaker of the House type person. This is someone who literally will call for a vote. This someone will start with like the order of business and which cases we should review, all that different stuff. He'll ultimately be the one that breaks the tie if needed, because there's 9 on the Supreme Court. If 4 rule one way and 4 rule the other, then the Chief Justice will cast the tiebreaker. But other than that, they're virtually the same. Now, how are they chosen? As you learned in the previous unit, the president's the one who picks these guys, and then the Senate ultimately confirms them. And if the Senate doesn't confirm them, then that person doesn't become Supreme Court Justice, part of the whole checks and balances thing. Here's a picture of Merrick Garland here. I put this picture here because back in the Obama administration, literally about 4 months before Obama was leaving office, Justice Scalia passed away. So President Barack Obama, using his rightful presidential powers, chose a new Supreme Court justice. And Merrick Garland was his pick. And then the Senate decided not to confirm Merrick Garland. So just because a president picks someone, in other words, doesn't mean it's actually a done deal. Sorry, Merrick Garland. That speech was cool, but anywho, how long do they serve? Once you're appointed a justice, you have that position for life. The framers of our government wanted to make sure that that was the case for the Supreme Court. And if you remember the Federalist Papers, you probably remember why. They wanted to make sure that the justices weren't concerned with like job security and making sure that, well, I got to rule this way in order to make sure people keep voting me in. No, they wanted to make sure that these justices were ruling fairly based upon their legal expertise. That's why they serve for life. Now, before we move on any more of the Supreme Court, I want to validate to make sure that we all understand how a courtroom actually works, because some people watch Law and Order and some people don't. So, how do courts work? So, regardless if you're talking about the Supreme Court or if you're talking like Palm Beach County Courthouse, all courts perform the same exact basic function. They apply the law to an actual situation. The thing about the laws in our country is that they're very black and white. You know, if it says if you murder someone, that's bad and you'll get this punishment, that's black and white. But our situations, our lives, are very gray. I'll give you an example. Let's say I was doing 50 over the speed limit on Okeechobee, and I get pulled over. In a black and white scenario, I'm getting either a very hefty ticket or I'm going in the police car to the station and my car's getting impounded and all that different stuff. In a black and white world, that's exactly how it should be. But let's say it wasn't black and white. Let's say instead of just speeding because it was fun, I was speeding to the hospital because a loved one of mine was in the hospital on life support and they could die at any moment, and I wanted to see them one more time. Do you think a police officer would be looking at me speeding negligently or because I had a good reason? You get the idea. And that's why courts have been created. They take the black and white laws and apply it to our gray situations. Um, Keep in mind, though, we've talked a lot about courtrooms this year without actually talking about courtrooms this year. If you remember those amendments in the Bill of Rights, they said a lot about what our court systems are like, whether it be your right to a trial by jury, your right to remain silent, your right to sue someone if it exceeds over $20. In case you don't remember any of those amendments, feel free to pause if you want to read them. But you get the idea ultimately. So before we start talking about who's in the courtroom, there's two different types of cases. The first are criminal cases. A criminal case is when a court's going to determine whether or not the person accused is guilty of breaking one of the laws of our country. If they're found guilty, the court will also decide what the punishment will be. Pretty straightforward. Civil cases, these are when courts are going to settle a disagreement or a dispute between two parties. So what's ultimately the difference between civil and criminal? Criminal cases would be just like that example I showed you guys. If I was speeding 50 over Okeechobee, I broke a law. That's a criminal case. But let's say I was suing my landlord because when I moved in and my landlord promised to say, hey, I won't raise the rent during your first 6 months, and then he actually does it. Well, that would be a disagreement between two people. The landlord has every right to raise his rent, but you can see where the disagreement will be. No law is broken, but there's a serious problem between two parties. Those are criminal and civil cases. Now, inside the courtroom, regardless of what case you're in, you're going to see something known as a defendant. This is the person who answers either the complaint or the accusation and defends against it in a court of law. It could be a group of people, it could be a government body, or it could even be you. You'll find these in both types of cases. Specifically for civil cases, though, you'll find someone known as a plaintiff. A plaintiff is someone who brings a complaint against another party. You only find plaintiffs in civil cases. Now, the prosecution is a government body, like the police department, that brings criminal charges against a defendant. You'll see those in criminal cases. So if you walk into a courtroom, you can tell a lot of what's going on just by simply seeing who's sitting where. If you see a plaintiff there, then you know it's a civil case. If you see a prosecution, which would be like police officers or the state of Florida or the United States government, then you know it's a criminal case. Now, the next person in the courtroom is obviously the person in the center, a judge. So a judge is someone who is a public official appointed to decide cases in a court of law. They don't decide the verdict, that's the jury's job, but they will run the show of the trial as well as they will be the one to do the sentencing. Now, I know every year people look at this picture of Judge Judy and they always ask the question, is Judge Judy a real judge? The cases you see on her show are like real problems between people, but what she's doing is something known as arbitration. It's basically someone who's not a judge who's taking a dispute between two people and settling it outside of court. It's a lot more cost effective if the problems are minor. You don't have to worry about hiring attorneys, and they make a fun TV show to watch and it makes lots of money. So probably that answers your question for you. Now, inside that courtroom, there's also a very vital member known as the jury. So a jury is 12 people who are sworn in to give a verdict in a case on the basis of evidence submitted to them in a court of law. And depending on what case it is, depends on how many of them have to agree on that case. If it's a criminal case, they need to be unanimous, regardless if it's innocent or guilt. Meaning, they got to be 100% sure it's innocent or 100% sure that it's guilty. We'll talk about what happens if they're not in a bit. In a civil case, though, there's not as much at risk in a civil case. It's just a disagreement between two people. It's not like a murderer is going to be released onto the streets. In that case, you just need a simple majority. Now, I know what you might be thinking also, or at least three of you might be thinking. So what's that jury duty thing actually like? So being that most of you guys are at least 18 years old, you have a driver's license, and hopefully none of you guys are felons, you will most likely find yourself in a courtroom someday to serve on a jury. But why, Mr. Shoens? Why do I gotta do this? Well, jury duty is your duty as a citizen of the United States. It's one of the cornerstones to our entire justice system, the concept of having a trial of your peers. You don't want a judge who can potentially be corrupted in your court case. You want people that are just like you, average Joes, deciding whether you're innocent or guilty. Without a trial of your peers, our justice system would be corrupted and flawed. So that's why you have to do it. So what is it actually like though? Well, you'll get something like this in the mail. It'll be something very similar to this, but it'll say something like juror summons on it. If you do receive one of these in the mail, first of all, don't panic. Don't throw it away as junk mail. Just open it up and see what's asked of you. There's going to be a date there that says when they want you in the courtroom, so whatever date it may be, and that's when you are summoned for jury duty. But what if I can't show up for that day? Well, each state's different on how they handle that, but for Florida, it's pretty simple. You can postpone your jury service as long as you contact the office of the courthouse before your actual jury duty. And you can reschedule it anywhere from the original date 6 months into the future. So like if I got jury duty in April, I can postpone it all the way to like October if I so chose. Although if you do just fail to show up, you will find yourself in trouble most likely. So what do? You show up to the courtroom, you wait in line, you bring your juror summons, you check in as a juror, you validate your parking if you're in the Palm Beach County Courthouse. Otherwise, all that money you made that day is going to disappear in parking fees. Don't ask me how I know this. And much more. Uh, at that point, you'll be just pretty much put in a room, and they'll probably just put a bunch of movies on for you to watch to basically pass the time until your trial is up and they call you into the actual courtroom. Uh, so just get comfortable at that point. Or maybe your name will be the first one called. That actually happened to me once. Not the first name, but literally the third name in a room of like hundreds of people. It's like, Shoens, you're up. It's like, oh boy. At that point, you'll be sworn in as a juror and escorted to the courtroom that you've been assigned for the case you've been assigned. But at this point, you still may not even serve on an actual jury because when you enter the courtroom, both the prosecution and the plaintiff are going to interview you to make sure you're not potentially biased. And if you are biased, then they don't want you on the jury, so you'll be sent out at that point. Or maybe you'll have that awkward moment when you're selected. Depending on your case, you might be there all day, might be there all week, maybe even longer. But don't worry, your employer, your university, your teachers, all those people have to excuse you for your absences because this is your civic duty. And at that point, the trial goes on. So you already accomplished at that point step one of a trial. The jury will be selected. Then the trial itself will go on, and you'll see witnesses and evidence presented and testimony. Then once that's all presented and each side has given their closing arguments, the jury will be sent out for a verdict. If they can't reach a verdict, it's something known as a hung jury, and the case will be tried again before another jury. And then if they do reach a verdict, whether it be criminal or civil, there will be sentencing if there is guilt found. And then the judge will be the one that decides the sentence. And don't worry, the law decides the minimum and maximum. The judge just simply decides whether you deserve the minimum or maximum or somewhere in between. But what if the judge has to deal with something that they've never dealt with before, like segregation in public schools? Well, at that point, that judge might have to rule outside of the law because there would be nothing written for it yet and establish something known as a precedent. A precedent is a guideline on how future cases should be decided in the future, meaning other judges are going to look at that case and rule based upon what you did. But what if I don't like my outcome? That's okay also. You can appeal. Appealing is basically going to a higher court and saying, hey, I don't think justice was done, and they can look to see if justice was done. If they agree with you, you have the right to a retrial.